Great. Well, thanks again, everyone, for joining us. It's a couple minutes past noon here, and we're going to get started with our webinar. This will be recorded, so look out for it to be posted later if you'd like to share it or review part of the webinar. Really excited to, I think, bring this topic forward for the first time to our Water Wednesday webinar series on data centers. To put it into a little sort of more immediate context for everyone, and for Potomac Riverkeeper Network, you may have seen an announcement earlier this month designating the Potomac River as the #1 most endangered river nationally. This is a project of both Potomac Riverkeeper Networks and Nature Fords with American Rivers. It's a national annual program that American Rivers um, publishes each year to highlight rivers that are endangered by different threats. And the designation this year came about kind of an interesting way, um, on the heels of a new report by the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin in December that, for the first time, really shone a light on the threat that data center development poses to future water use security in the region. We started working together with American Rivers to bring forward the Potomac as one of those most endangered rivers for 2026 to highlight this issue um, of growing concern. And only a few weeks into developing this project, I'm expecting many people are aware, the Potomac Interceptor, a major sewer collection infrastructure in Maryland, serves portions of Virginia, also directs sewage to the Blue Plains wastewater treatment plant in DC, ruptured, and for a matter of a couple of weeks, spilled over 200 million gallons of sewage to the Potomac. And so that brought an immediate, also infrastructure related threat to our attention that was unavoidable and became part, as well as data centers, of our public communications around the Potomac River's most endangered designation. But data centers remain an important part of this project moving forward. And that's why we're really excited to bring this issue forward today for discussion with our esteemed guests and panelists, Kevin Coyle and Lydia Lawrence. We're going to talk about data centers, and in particular, the threat data center development and operations poses to not just water use, but water quality in the Potomac River Basin. And so with that, I'm going to introduce both of our panelists. They're going to provide some remarks to help orient us to this subject. If you have questions along the way, please do add them to our Q&A box. We're going to reserve time this hour to get to questions and more of a free-form discussion with our panelists. Kevin J. Coyle is an attorney and natural resource planner with more than 4 decades of experience in environmental conservation and education, including as an executive for the U.S. Department of the Interior, CEO of American Rivers, and the head of the congressionally chartered National Environmental Education Foundation. Kevin was also vice president of and counsel to the president of the National Wildlife Federation. Kevin currently serves as a board member for the Potomac Riverkeeper Network. Lydia Lawrence is the Director of Conservation with Nature Ford. In this role, Lydia directs the organization's advocacy and community engagement programming in the District, Maryland, and Virginia. Lydia and her team lead a multi-jurisdictional campaign focused on the threat that unchecked data center development and operations pose to communities and their environment through impacts to the region's energy, water, and land resources. Lydia has professional training and experience in human health as a registered nurse and is a leader in the environmental sector on issues of justice, equity, and community engagement. And with that, I will pass to Kevin.
Thank you, David, and thank you everyone for joining. Good afternoon. As David said, my name is Kevin Coyle, and I have a story to tell you about getting into the data center issue, which was that about 5 years ago, I was walking down the street in my community, and a neighbor walked by and said, "Hey, did you hear they're going to develop a data center next to our subdivision?" And I said, "No, I didn't hear." And so I realized that I didn't know very much about data centers. And what I found out was not only were they building a data center, but they were building the largest data center complex in the world with 37 data centers. And a number of our neighbors began to get together and to look at what was going on and what was involved. And this is a project called the Prince William Digital Gateway, which we heard this morning. One of the developers for that project is withdrawing from the project after battling the community for 5 years. But what I also did as an environmental professional was I began to really dig in and look at the implications of data centers. And if you read the media or you look at news articles about data centers, there's a lot about energy. There's a lot about power usage, about how they draw down so much power and they impose such a burden on the local ratepayers. But there's also quite a bit about the noise that they generate, the infringement on local neighborhoods and schools and so forth. There's another story to data centers that I want to talk to you about today, and that's the water story. And data centers, if Ashley, we could put the first slide up, that would be helpful. Data centers are basically the sort of sold by the data industry as oversized office buildings. And this is a typical view. QTS happens to be one of the companies that's involved with the Prince William Digital Gateway. And this is what they present to you. They present these pictures of beautiful buildings with in bucolic settings, and so forth. But if we can go to the next slide, this is really what a data center is. And I want to point out that this is a relatively small data center. And what you see here is that they're industrial buildings. You see backup generation, you see rooftop coolers. Inside are hundreds of thousands of computers. And it's really quite an industrial complex. So I just want to make that point. And the question then is, what is the list of things that data centers have that threaten water quality and water quantity? So the first of those is the backup generation of choice is diesel generation. And in the Northern Virginia area and parts of Maryland, there are likely to be more than 30,000 diesel generators in this area. And if you were to turn all of those on at one time, they would burn 3 million gallons of diesel fuel per hour. So just think about that in terms of scale. And the reason that's significant is they have to store this diesel on site. They're going to need to run for many hours if there's an overload on the power grid. So diesel generation and the storage of diesel, the potential leakage, and how this will get worse over time is a big issue. The second issue, which gets talked about a lot, is water withdrawals. And there are some data centers that actually rely on water cooling, but most of them are combined systems. So you see in this slide here, there's a lot of rooftop blowers, chillers, and so forth, basically air conditioners. And they rely on a cooling system that draws water every now and again. And that can add up because they're in the process of building about 1,000 data centers in Northern Virginia and parts of Maryland. So the scale of withdrawal is going to be pretty significant for the Potomac River, even though these are in many cases closed systems. And because it's a closed water cooling system, the water stays in there for a while, but it needs to be flushed out. And that means that it gathers anti-corrosives, it gathers coolant chemicals, salts. There's a variety of things that come out, and those all should be treated. But in many cases, they're not being treated. They're just being put into local streams under a permitting program by the state departments of environmental quality. The chemicals that are in these buildings, they have to be kept squeaky clean. So they have a lot of cleaning chemicals. They have a lot of cooling chemicals, as I mentioned. Importantly, the computers that are in there have a lot of PFAS, the forever chemicals. They also have quite a number of toxic metals. These can include arsenic, mercury, lithium, cadmium, lead, and so forth. And the important thing to know about data centers is that every year, about 20% of the computers that are in these data centers will need to be taken out. So that's going to be tens of millions of computers every year. The data industry will tell you they're going to recycle a lot of that material, but they're not going to get all of it. In fact, they're not even probably going to get a significant percentage of it. So that's going to go into landfills, and that's another threat to the Potomac River. Another thing to consider is the size of these buildings and the fact that these complexes of data centers need to actually be cleared for security reasons. There needs to be a line of sight in case there's any sabotage or anything proposed. So the runoff potential from clustering these data centers in certain areas, like the Goose Creek, Broad Run in Loudoun County, the Occoquan system in Prince William County, Virginia, that poses a huge runoff threat. And that's going to all affect drinking supplies, et cetera, because data centers are basically located in this region. If we can go to the next slide, the data centers are basically located upstream from the Potomac River's drinking supply intakes, and that includes the main stem of the Potomac and the Occoquan. So in addition to that, as these data centers are built, there are two other watershed impacts that really need to be looked at. And one of those is the number of power substations that are needed. So for about every 4 data centers or 5 data centers, there's a power substation is needed. These are prone to catch fire periodically. They can cause damage to groundwater. There's a variety of ways that they can affect the river. And then finally, power lines are needed. Locally, you'll see them building quite a number of power lines, but they come from long distances that cut through the broader Potomac watershed. And that has also some effects on the river, its ecology, and so forth. So generally speaking, when they present themselves as large office buildings, what it really is the largest massing of industrial material that any state really has ever seen in such a short period of time. So I'll stop there and pass it on back to David, and David, you can go from there.
Thank you, Kevin. Really helpful overview. We definitely have some follow-up questions for you to dig in deeper on some of the water quality and water use pieces. But before we get to that, Lydia,
Yes, thank you, David. And let me go ahead and I'm gonna share my slides with y'all. There we go. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Lydia Lawrence. I am the Conservation Director for Nature Forward. And actually, let me, can you all see are you seeing the big slide or the smaller? The big one? Okay, cool. Nature Forward is the oldest environmental nonprofit in serving the DC metro region. We were founded way back in 1897. And we really look at advocating at the nexus of climate and human health because we think that nature needs all of us and all of us need nature. And in our advocacy, we really see that manifesting in our priorities of human health and access to nature, protecting wildlife habitat and biodiversity, fighting the climate crisis, and also fighting for sustainable land use. And so as we looked at data centers, we found that data center development really has such a profound impact on all of those priorities. And before I go further, I just want to emphasize we all use data centers. Data centers are supporting this virtual call right now. And so we recognize that they are a part of the virtual fabric of our society. They have been around for decades. They started as server rooms, maybe in a company where we would store our virtual information for anyone who's old enough to remember the advent of computers and then floppy disks and CDs. And they have since evolved to what used to be these small, discrete server buildings where people would store their digital information. It is only in the last 10 or so years with the advent of generative artificial intelligence that we have seen this huge proliferation of data center development, what we call hyperscale data center development, which are essentially data center buildings, according to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, that consume 20 megawatts of energy or more. So they're considered these really energy intensive infrastructure. So Nature Forward's not against all data centers, but we strongly emphasize the need for transparency, for common sense guardrails that protect our water from pollution, that require sustainable consumption of the water that is consumed, that do not proliferate fossil fuel development. We really believe that this industry, like other industries, needs to be constrained by guardrails, and we need to plan data center development in a way that protects our environment and protects communities. Um, and here you see an example in this picture from one of the data center tours we did in Northern Virginia that shows a data center back there right by an athletic field. There are also houses nearby and a playground. And this is a really good example of a poorly planned data center that is impacting people's health. As Kevin shared, it has the diesel backup generators that are the size of train cars that are polluting communities that live in that area. So I'm going to zoom back from Kevin's very excellent focus on water and talk more broadly about the impacts of data centers on our climate. As I shared, they're very large, energy intensive industrial buildings. Once a data center comes online, the expectation is that it runs 24/7 because its clients expect reliability. If y'all remember, there have been times earlier this year where certain data centers have gone out, and things like, I remember that day for me, I couldn't get on like Canva, or we had issues with our Zoom account. I saw an article from the Washington Post that people's sleep number beds were acting really weird. And that was because the data center went out. But these things require a lot of energy. In Virginia alone, we have seen Dominion Energy, which is the utility, almost triple its estimate of the number of contracts it has for energy with data center developers. For example, back in June of 2024, it estimated that it needed about 25 gigawatts of energy for Virginia to give to data center development. And because I didn't know this until I started working on data centers, I want to put that into perspective. 1 gigawatt is the equivalent of about one natural gas power plant. North Anna, the nuclear plant in Virginia, is about 1.5 gigawatts. So I'm going to repeat that number. Back in June of 2024, Dominion estimated that it needed 25 gigawatts, which is like 25 more power plants in Virginia for its data center needs. Before data centers started developing in Northern Virginia, our energy demand was actually plateauing due to our homes becoming more energy efficient. We were moving towards renewable energy. And it was not until generative AI and the hyperscale data center development to support them that we really started seeing these astronomical demands on our electric utility. So let's jump forward in time to today. Just recently, Dominion announced that its data center needs for power that it's, worked with data center developers are 70 gigawatts, 70. That's almost triple what it was about 2 years ago. And that's how quickly data centers are asking to build in this area and within the Potomac watershed. The state of Maryland has about 3 gigawatts estimated in construction or planned. And that doesn't count other areas like Charles County or Calvert Cliffs, where official applications have not been submitted. And compared to 70 gigawatts, 3 gigawatts might sound like nothing, but let's remember that's three additional power plants in a region that is already under severe demand. And these power plants have huge impacts on our water, right? Kevin talked about how the data centers themselves can consume a lot of water, especially depending on the cooling system that they're using. A report from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in 2024 reported that US data centers consumed 17 billion gallons of water for cooling. But if you take into account the amount of water that's needed for the power plants or the electricity that is used to sustain these data centers, we have to add an additional 211 billion gallons of water in 2024 alone that is used to support data centers. And that's just consumption, which is a huge, huge amount. And that's from energy. Kevin talked about the backup diesel generators that support data centers. Currently, there's not really any reporting requirements for when data centers use these backup diesel generators, but Caltech University and University of California, Riverside did study and estimate what the maintenance of diesel generators, all these diesel generators require ongoing maintenance, what that costs to our health. And in places like Fairfax County, it costs about $18 million in public health costs just from the maintenance of diesel generators. And that those impacts go as far as Baltimore City, DC, Anne Arundel County, all through the watershed. There are health impacts from just the data centers in Northern Virginia, their diesel generator maintenance. We talked a lot about energy. If we're building new power plants, we need the ability to take the power generated by that plant to its destination, the data center. Kevin talked about substations. One huge impact to our water beyond the data centers themselves is the transmission lines that it will take to carry the power from new power plants to data centers. Those transmission lines are cutting through conservation easements, farmland, mature forest. They're running alongside riparian buffers or adjacent to streams, rivers, and that loss of natural land has huge impacts on our ability for clean water, to keep our watershed clean. And then a lot of people who live near data centers complain of constant light security. They keep the lights on 24/7. as well as some data centers emit constant noise. Um, and then I'm not going to go over the water resources too much because Kevin did an excellent job of that. But there are different cooling levels, types of cooling for data centers. Closed loop cooling, which does require water to be filled. It can be 1 million, it can be hundreds of thousands of gallons per day, depending on how much is filled. But there are also data centers that require evaporative cooling, which means when data center goes in, or water goes into the data center to cool, it's being evaporated back out into the air. And so that has huge impacts on the amount of water consumed. And if we say, well, don't use water for cooling, just use air conditioning, HVAC, we still end up consuming water because that requires a lot more energy. So either way, water is being impacted. And so Nature Forward approached this issue in many different ways. We are fighting this issue in Northern Virginia at a local level, and then also in Maryland. We formed a coalition called Marylanders for Data Center Reform, where we just passed legislation this past General Assembly to require data centers to have to register and report on water consumption, requires data centers to use more renewable energy. And so if you're part of an organization, you're welcome to join that coalition if you're serving Maryland. But we also have a website where you can, if you want to sign up for a course on data centers, we have about 7 classes that really dive in to these impacts. We have free webinars as well that talk more about all different data center impacts. And then we're constantly sending forward different action alerts for Virginia and for Maryland and DC related to climate, environment, and data center impacts. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Lydia. And thanks again, Kevin. I'm going to take a moment to note again that we have a Q&A function for everyone who's attending this webinar. Please add questions. We're gonna pivot here in a moment to answering your questions and having hopefully it's still very engaging dialogue with Lydia and Kevin here on this subject. There are a million one directions to go with this topic, even just where it concerns water use and water quality. I'd like to make one substantive point to underline. I think what Kevin and Lydia were also pointing to is, and I imagine we have attendees here as well who are feeling this firsthand. This is not an issue that is threatening just people in the major metropolitan parts of the Potomac River Basin. This is a presently an issue that's affecting folks throughout the watershed, whether that's proposed interstate transmission lines that will be going through natural areas in the upper watershed that is so important to conserving water quality and water quantity, as well as proposals for data centers that are on the threshold for folks in Western Virginia and the Eastern Panhandle of West Virginia. I think it's probably pretty hard at this point to find any part of the Potomac River Basin that isn't touched by this issue of the data center industry in some not too attenuated way. And so, focused on those who are feeling sort of the presently, the impact of data centers, for folks in Northern Virginia in particular, in Data Center Alley, where data centers are currently operational, to folks in communities that are, maybe fighting for responsible development or even opposing data centers. My first question is to both you, Kevin, and Lydia, knowing that you both are firsthand experiencing this in your individual lives, and then also working with communities directly and organizing on this very issue. Can you speak to either the concerns that you've heard from community members around water and water impacts, or whether you've encountered folks who have stories to tell about how data center development or operations are already affecting their ability to access water or have clean water in their local streams and rivers?
Lydia, I'll defer to you first.
That's very kind of you, Kevin. Yeah, we definitely hear a lot of concerns. One of the biggest questions I get is, how are we tracking how much water data centers use? What kind of cooling system are they using? And that's a hard question to answer because until very, very recently, there wasn't really any legislation in place that required, whether it be water utilities or whether it be data centers reporting themselves, any type of tracking of water consumption. Data centers for both Virginia and Maryland have to get a permit for any discharge, water discharge that they do. And I know probably David and Kevin are very much experts on all things related to the Clean Water Act. But they don't actually have to report on water consumption. Until very recently, Virginia just passed a bill that was signed into law that does require water utilities to report the monthly or quarterly aggregate estimate of how much water is going to data centers. But before then, there were times that you could reach out like to a certain water utility and say, hey, how much water is going to data centers if I have a few data centers in my county, and they may or may not track that. Loudon Water started tracking that because they have a recycled water program and they also have about the highest concentration of data centers in their area. But not every water utility was required to track that. And then data centers as well were not required to report what kind of cooling system they use, how often they demand water. There aren't really any reporting requirements on data centers themselves. So it's a very frustrating and concerning question. People are worried about their utility bills. One thing that we see a lot of rural communities having to deal with is even if a data center is on what is called a closed loop system. Again, they may or may not report this information. It may not be known to the public. But if they are, which requires, they fill their cooling loop at a certain time and that water is recirculated with only a little bit amount of loss, it has to be refreshed periodically. And if a water utility, is not equipped to even one time provide 1 million gallons of treated water to this data center, then there is a lot of infrastructure upgrades that need to happen for that utility to be able to serve a data center. So I'll stop talking and go to Kevin.
David, I think a lot of my experience has been at the local level, and generally speaking, the water issue's been less of an issue than some of the other things, like the noise issues and imposing on neighborhoods and schools and things like that. But when at the grassroots level, when the water issues come up, one of the first things that people are concerned about is flooding. So you have an area that was wooded, maybe 100, 200, sometimes 800 acres that was wooded, and suddenly it's being cleared, and people know that down the road there's going to be this gigantic set of buildings in there with everything turning into runoff. And I will say that one of the features of local land use planning is that they're really doing an inadequate job of flood retention. That's one of the issues for the Potomac is they're building on old models that don't include the kind of deluge rains that we have these days. And so that's a concern is flooding. Another concern that I see raised constantly at the local level and with the counties and so forth is wetland loss and riparian area loss. Even though the Chesapeake Bay, the counties have agreed to protect those areas, according to the Chesapeake Bay Agreement, they're really not abiding by them. And so there's a lot of manipulation of wetland areas, draining of wetland areas, pretending like they're not there, and very weak enforcement of those things. And then Lydia was mentioning how hard it is to get information on what water they're using. And one thing that people may or may not know on the call is data centers operate with non-disclosure agreements. And they do that for the technologies that are in the buildings, including the heating and cooling systems. They do that for the designs of their buildings, et cetera. And so you have this kind of odd situation where you've got citizens that are faced with a building that could be 500,000 square feet, the size of 3 Walmarts, and they can't get any information on it because it's protected by non-disclosure agreements, and that's very common. And so one of the things that's happening now in the state legislature for Virginia, and I believe in Maryland as well, are disclosure laws that say you have to say how much energy you're using, and you have to say how much water you're using. So those are the things that I experience at kind of the grassroots level.
Yeah, another thing too is construction.
Yeah.
Um, in Frederick County in Maryland with the quantum loophole development, there has been a huge amount of pollution and violations that have occurred in Frederick County for the Monocacy River, in terms of the construction of the data center. Fiber optic cables have to be laid for that connectivity piece. Like internet is physical infrastructure, Verizon Fios is fiber optics. And that has caused a huge amount of environmental violations that we've seen state departments continue to just give like slap on the wrist as these violations occur repeatedly. And then community members have also complained about during the construction process increased sediment to their well water that has come from construction as well. So I'll stop there. I'm sure Kevin and I can go all day on all the different water
There's
stuff.
so much. There's so much.
Yeah, thank you for raising the construction stormwater piece, particularly for very large development sites, as opposed to maybe just development of household. Failing sediment controls can have result in enormous quantities of sediment running into sometimes relatively small river and stream systems that will have impacts for decades.
Mhm.
To connect to something else that you said, Lydia, a question from one of our attendees about costs to water users. I think, at the regional scale, part of the discourse has been looking ahead at, the threat that water demand from this sector will pose to water use, right? Security for drinking water purposes years into the future. Lydia, you suggested something about how at the local level, where data centers are already being developed or proposed for development, that there's a need to maybe expand or build new water infrastructure to serve those developments. Um, are those costs that we know are already being um, borne by residents? If so, are there, particular jurisdictions where this has already become an issue, or maybe there are other jurisdictions that we should be watching for this to become an emerging issue?
That's an excellent question. And yes, it is something that if a jurisdiction has to upgrade its water infrastructure to serve a data center, that can be a cost that is divided out into everyone's utility bills. And I will say, and I'm trying to find this because I can't remember it off the top of my head. There was a jurisdiction that negotiated with Amazon where Amazon agreed to pay upfront for the upgrade of the water utility in order to serve the needs of the data center. So that is something I would encourage members on this call to advocate for to your local jurisdiction.
Mhm.
whether you have a data center coming to your town yet or not, is to, if they are going to come, because sometimes it's just a matter of the local governing body. Sometimes you can get a moratorium for a temporary delay, or sometimes there have been regions that have even considered permanently just data centers are not for this region, for this jurisdiction. But there are a lot more local jurisdictions where no matter how many people we gather to say this is, not what we want, or we want this with guardrails, we know that like the governing body still moves the project forward because they're very attracted to the revenue that this type of project could potentially bring. So if it's a matter of this is coming, no matter how many people we line up to say no, I think it's a very solid solution to offer your elected officials to say, have them pay for our utility for that infrastructure upgrade, because a lot of local officials don't know what's required in order to support this type of development.
David, the one thing I would add to that is right now in the Washington, D.C. metro area, there are several water treatment plants, water treatment systems. And if you use the Occoquan as an example, that serves about 1 million users. And it's now guaranteed that because of the concentration of data centers in that watershed, that they will have to go to a much more advanced multi-billion-dollar improvement to that treatment system. And that cost is not being borne by the data centers that are generating the problem. It's going to be borne by the water users. And so that's an example where I think that and DC Water are going to really have to cope with much higher water treatment costs.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Lydia. Before we get too close to the end of the hour, there are a couple of requests in the chat, Lydia, to provide links to Nature Forward's resources, including the classes. If you could post those into the chat, that'd be terrific. And while you're doing that, I'm gonna kick a question over to Kevin because this is directly in your wheelhouse, Kevin. Hoping you could talk a little bit more about the water quality contaminants or the quality of the water that is used for cooling, right? The water that's first drawn from the river basin, and then at the time it's discharged back to surface waters or sent to a treatment plant. What are the kinds of water quality contaminants that we should expect to see in that effluent? And then in addition to that, if you could maybe talk a little bit more in detail about the other kinds of water quality contaminants or pollutants we might expect to see in the stormwater discharge from data centers that are in operation, including the prospect of chemical spills or other sort of incidents that could arise.
Mm-hmm. So in the cooling systems, a lot of the data centers in Northern Virginia, for example, are not using straight water cooling systems. They're using combination systems, as we mentioned before. And so they load up the water and then they use air conditioners basically to cool the water and recirculate it to cool the computers. So it kind of runs that way. People refer to these as closed systems. But in order for that to work well, the first thing I have to do is put cooling chemicals in. And these are, real honest to God, nasty chemicals that you don't want in your drinking water. They also need to put in anti-corrosives because the water will leak the pipes in different ways. Sometimes there's an accumulation of salt that comes. Sometimes the pipes themselves leach into the water, with various kinds of PFAS contaminants and so forth. And the result is that this water will get discharged. There will be some effort to treat it, but the treatment will not get all of the various contaminants and so forth that are in it. So Um, that's another example where the industry is generating an environmental problem, but it doesn't want to pay for it. And so that's a consistent theme that Lydia has pointed out very eloquently in a couple of places here. The second thing is that these sites themselves are like any big shopping center or any big airport. The thing I mentioned earlier, the Prince William Digital Gateway, is as big as National Airport and LaGuardia combined. And so when you clear that much land, in order to keep it usable, you have to apply various kinds of chemicals for snow treatment. There are materials that are in the vehicles that service those areas. The There are going to be leaks of varying kinds for the diesel generator infrastructure, the loading and unloading of diesel, all of that. And those are all chemicals that will run down into from the surface down into local streams. So the Digital Gateway is an example where it's right next to Little Bull Run, of Manassas battlefield fame, and Bull Run itself, and we'll go down into the Occoquan and then ultimately into the Delaware, into the Potomac. So you have this, sort of runoff that generates sediment, and in addition to that, wash off that generates a lot of chemical content and salt content to that runoff.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Um, so we've got a number of requests for folks who are looking for resources and to get connected into maybe groups locally where data centers have already been proposed, or we might expect them to be proposed so they can be connected with other community advocates locally. I think in Berkeley County, West Virginia, I saw one request there. Lydia, if you have any thoughts to share with folks. I want to talk a little bit about policymaker response to this issue. And I'm going to use a question that came from one of our attendees that notes, isn't the Potomac in a prolonged drought? Are data centers even sustainable, right? And yeah, the Potomac is in a prolonged drought. Obviously, we've been talking, or a lot of the discourse has been not just in this webinar today, but looking forward into the future. What does this rapid development of data centers lock us into in terms of future water scarcity? Is it prudent, right, to do that? And how do we put in context sort of those questions with what we're already experiencing today in the region with drought, and not just drought, again, affecting people in the major metropolitan areas where water is drawn from the river, but drought throughout the watershed, right? So for people who rely upon the aquifers in rural parts of the watershed for their drinking water needs, or agriculture or local industry, where data centers may increasingly be sited and may draw right from those water resources. So that's a big question, right? And I'm definitely curious, Kevin and Lydia, for sort of your response to that. But I'm wondering if you could tell us anything about, in your work talking with policymakers broadly defined, so everyone at the local level, maybe they're local land use regulators or local elected officials, through to folks who are state lawmakers or in state gubernatorial administrations. How are they sort of holding those two sort of aspects of this issue, the concern about stewarding what the future for us holds in development of this industry, with also just dealing with the constraints and risks that we're facing today?
I can just jump in quickly and say that just yesterday I had a meeting with our local senator, state senator Danica Rome, and our local delegate Josh Thomas, and I talked to them about, the focus is energy, 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 and what about water? And they were like a little caught by that, just, and I suggested, just as the I'm going to get the title wrong. It's the JLARC committee, the Joint Advisory. Anyway, there's a state committee that does studies. That they need to do a study on water and the water impacts, because I think that's a concern that's real, and it's a concern that's being largely overlooked. And they agreed with that. They didn't agree necessarily that JLARC was the best place to do it. They thought maybe DEQ might be a better place to do it under Spanberger. But in the course of that conversation, what we talked about was, drought conditions and aquifer recharge. And I think you all know that the Potomac's aquifer is deep and old. And as a result, the recharge of the Potomac aquifer goes slowly. And so the data centers sucking up this water, 1,000 of them sucking up this water, even if they have a closed system, which most of them do, is still going to be huge. And I think Lydia pointed that out, that so that is going to be a problem for people on wells. That's going to be a problem for industry, that towns that rely on aquifer water, etc. And most of our drinking water in this area is piped. It's surface water from the Potomac or the Occoquan. But there's a lot of communities very close to the Washington, D.C. area and other parts of Virginia that do rely on wells. And so the data centers are going to exacerbate the drawdown problem and make water more difficult to acquire, and you're going to have to drill the wells deeper. It's not going to be a good thing.
Yes, and I'm going to add in the chat a link for y'all to a study that was just released from Loudoun County on the impact to groundwater. As Kevin put it, like for wells, also if you have all this development that is so prolific, sucking up groundwater to support the infrastructure, what does that do as, our water table declines, right? But to answer David's question, and with respect to the fact that both Potomac Riverkeeper Network and Nature Forward are 501c3 organizations, so we are both nonpartisan. And what I will say is that our elected officials are more likely to respond to the issues that will make their constituents vote them in or out of office. And that is still 501c3 legal to say. And I think this is a very real thing when we look at Kevin's fight in Prince William County, where local groups really engaged around engaged around making data center impacts the issue on the ballot. In Maryland, through Marylanders for Data Center Reform, 2026 is an election year for governors, the governor, for legislators. And so we made ratepayer protections for energy the issue. It became the overarching issue within the Maryland General Assembly. It was an issue, people's bills, which goes back to water infrastructure if our utility bills are going up. But people's bills, when they see them going up, for some reason they don't get happy. It makes them upset. It makes them want to take action and say, what can we do about this? And we were able to really use that concern to make data centers an issue with state elected officials. And some of them weren't too interested when we started talking to them last summer. Some of them were, but by the time the state legislature came around, General Assembly, we had built enough of a fervor of people being really upset about unaffordable energy bills that this became the main talking point where even the people, the legislators who wouldn't talk to us um, during the summer were suddenly clamoring to learn more about all the different ways data center development impacts their constituents because their constituents cared about the issue. And I think the same tack, we plan to use the same tack on water. And I know Potomac Riverkeeper Network does as well, especially as we're going into the summer, as we're going into the next year to plan for 2027. But making water the issue with this most endangered rivers. I mean, the Potomac River being named #1 is no small thing. And data centers being a cause a part of that is no small thing. And your elected officials need to hear that this is the issue that you really, really care about, that you want them to act on. And that I have found is so far, it's not 100% success rate, but it's more effective when their job is on the line.
Thank you, Lydia. Thanks, Kevin. I want to bring us back down to the local level, sort of on the same issue. Um, so the first one, I think Kevin, Lydia, sort of informed by um, your experience, working in communities, organizing communities, leading community engagement, you know, um, for anyone working on this subject, it's hard to get one's arms around it, right? There are a million and one different impacts. The connection, the technical issues are complicated. Um, and it can be pretty overwhelming for someone who's sort of just starting to dip their toes into this, but really eager to get involved and maybe advocate, maybe not just on behalf of the local community, but also with statewide electeds, for instance, as you were discussing, Lydia. What would you advise someone, including some attendees here, about how to get connected in to folks in their community to identify what is that one or two or three different issues that are really the sort of shared concerns and build power around that? Um, how would you advise someone to get involved in that way?
Kevin, I don't know if you want to talk about your experience in Prince
No,
William County. Um,
yeah, I'm happy to. David, I think generally speaking, almost the way it works is on a county level for the most part. And so there are nonprofit organizations at the county level that, if you're a national group or a regional group, you know about, but you don't necessarily have much of a relationship with. So use Prince William County as an example. There's a Prince William Conservation Alliance, and there's a group called the Coalition to Protect Prince William County. And they are really the hubs for a lot of the neighborhood and community type um, organizing and so forth. Loudoun County has similar organizations. Stafford County has just started an organization with the help of the Riverkeeper. And what I would say is that use Uncle Google and get on there and look for these local groups, because there's almost every county organization is connected in one way or another to the data center issue. One thing that I also want to mention is the Piedmont Environmental Council. And the Piedmont Environmental Council has done extraordinary and heroic work on organizing a statewide coalition. And so if you go to their website and you look for the Data Center Reform Coalition, and see who's the membership of that coalition, you will have a pretty good map of where, in your area, who to get in touch with, and so forth. So those are a couple thoughts about that.
Yes, I would thank you for asking that question. And to every person on the call, please do not underestimate your power as just one person to really rally others on an issue. Um, it can be through a nonprofit. Nature Forward has supported um, different community groups who are battling data center development in Northern Virginia. Kevin mentioned Piedmont Environmental Council. In West Virginia, Tucker United and West Virginia Rivers Coalition are also working on this issue. Um, Potomac Riverkeeper Network is also in West Virginia with an Upper Potomac Riverkeeper as well. But I would also say I've seen, examples like, for example, Prince George's County, where Nature Forward was in there working with residents to try to
Mhm.
push back bad data center laws. And then one resident decided to create a petition and circulate it on social media, Taylor Fraser McCollum, and got enough support for it that it stopped a data center in Landover County and led to a 6-month moratorium and totally started a conversation that wasn't really at that point yet and changed the whole entire nature of the conversation by utilizing things like social media and a petition and next door and getting people together and then being able to ask for help from larger organizations who may not have initially been in the data center fight at the time. So there are so many different ways you can go about this, whether it be through an organization, or if you don't know an organization in their area, or some organizations aren't yet convinced to work on the issue, rabble rouse yourself and get people involved and show up at local town halls or elected official, whether it's a council or a board of supervisors meeting, and speak to the issue. And ask for meetings with whoever your local elected official is, and tell them how you feel. I mean, your elected official is elected by you and works for you.
Thank you, Lydia. Thanks, Kevin. And thanks for lifting up the accomplishments of the community in Prince George's County and pointing to our friends there. Really inspiring. You talked, Lydia, about sort of the strategy and organizing strategy and tactics that folks in Prince George's County, Maryland used. Can you talk at all, either in the context of that matter or Kevin and Lydia in other localities, on the substance? Recognizing that Lydia, you said before, state lawmakers or state electeds rather are driven in large part by, right, voting, right, remaining in office. They're motivated in that way. One of our attendees put a question in the chat that asks about the promise of revenues, right, from data center development to local governments that are already, I think in large part, whether they're very populous localities or more rural ones across the watershed, across the region, local governments are already dealing with budget shortfalls and new and expanding needs for their residents that have maybe absolutely nothing to do with data centers, right? But those are real, right? And so the promise of revenues from data centers, can you talk a little bit about maybe first about whether that's a real promise, right? And maybe just around the edges, sort of what kind of revenues local governments, maybe in our region, are actually seeing from data center development and operation. And then maybe talk a little bit about, again, sort of what are the substantive issues that one might be able to use to counter that promise of revenues in order to engage and maybe convince their local electeds or other folks in local government to think twice.
Yeah, thanks, David. That is a real promise that has been going forward, especially from data center developers. And it is a real shortfall that I see for local government and state government in terms of trying to attract development and data center development to their area. Um, regarding a local and state level, a lot of people point to Loudoun County and say they have gotten hundreds of millions of dollars of additional revenue from all these data centers, which is true. And that is one county. Different states, different counties have different revenue splits depending on what the legislation is, depending on what the development is. So I would encourage your, especially if it's local elected officials or even state, if we're talking about the revenue, I would encourage them, what is that actual breakdown that applies to your county or your state in terms of revenue? And then the other thing I would really encourage them, first off, I'm going to be a broken record. Do count which year is the election year. Because that does matter in how swayable they are. And the other thing I would say is that there are a lot of drawbacks that have not been quantified. As much as Loudoun County may have gotten additional revenue for programs, the state of Virginia in 2025 alone, a study from Good Jobs First found that the state of Virginia gave away $1.9 billion in 2025 alone for tax incentives to developers. So this is the number of data centers that were built, that were invested in Virginia, that Virginia said if you meet these requirements, you will not have to pay taxes on what goes into the data center. And they gave away $1.9 billion in just 1 year, in just 2025. That is a huge amount of money that is given away that could be going towards services, towards to support county budgets. And I think it's really important to highlight that. And then we don't necessarily have, we do have some numbers for like health impacts of the maintenance of diesel generators just in Northern Virginia in the year 2023, which in Fairfax County was about over $18 million in a year. And these are impacts that constituents are bearing. I haven't seen a quantification of, what does it look like if a locality has to upgrade their utility to support a data center, how much is that going to cost them upfront? How much will it cost them in the impacts for environmental, for health, for lost types of business development or housing development? There are so many unquantified yet, I'd like to say yet, impacts for all the different ways that data centers impact. What if one advocate we worked with in Prince George's County talked to council members along, if you're building up data centers and people don't want to live by them, it's the wealthy residents that are going to have the means to move to the next county where data centers aren't. Do you want to lose that tax base? So there are a lot of different arguments, even if you don't have the numbers. Again, it's power in the people coming together and saying these are all the different ways it impacts you. And sometimes it is a matter of your elected officials locally. They only know the developers' arguments of this is not a big deal. As Kevin said, look at this pretty building. It doesn't do anything. It just sits here. No big deal. And they legitimately do not know the impacts of this development. They just know they're getting a building for a lot of money. And so you sitting down and educating them on what those impacts are and how it impacts constituents is really important.
And if I were to add to that, David, I would say that use the Prince William Digital Gateway as an illustration. Those two companies came in, said, we want to build 37 data centers. And they used what I think of as magic wand accounting. And the magic wand was that they would push a button and all of these data centers would be paying taxes right away in the first year. And there would be $400 million generated. And that's the number that the county officials used constantly. We're going to get $400 million and so forth. So we did a study of that. And we looked at the the amortization of it, basically. And in order for the Prince William Digital Gateway to actually start making money for the county, it would take about 7 years. And then, and the reason for that was that the costs of building roads, building infrastructure, making sure that all the piping was there and everything else. Um, and the implication of that was also that it's important for people to know, at least in Virginia, how data centers are taxed, because they're not taxed just on real estate. The real estate tax is actually fairly minimal. It's the personal property tax of the computers that are inside the data centers, what they call the peripheral tax. And that tax amortizes on 5-year property, which means basically that if you load up a data center with computers, 5 years after that, the computers on the books have almost zero value. So they don't generate 400 million, they generate a much smaller percentage. And what we basically said was that at the peak, the digital gateway would generate a substantial amount of money, $130 million, but it would never hit um, uh, 400 million, and it would take 13 years for them to get to that 135 million. In the meantime, we were looking at signs on the highways that said, our schools need this money, that kind of thing. And I'm thinking, yeah, and those kids are going to be working for the data centers by the time the data centers actually begin to generate revenue, because they'll have graduated, have gotten to mid-career status. So the other thing that I'll just point out, Lydia's, talking about the activism. One aspect of activism that we used in Prince William County was to look at who's funding these elected officials. And I will tell you that the data industry passes out money like it's candy at a parade. And it's really important to know the websites and the ways of finding that out, because you will find in the state legislature, you will find in local county officials, there are very few local officials who turn down data center money. It's just there's so much money that Amazon, Microsoft, Meta, I'm forgetting Google. These companies have so much money, and these are multi-billion-dollar developments. That this is chicken feed for them to spread money around to local officials.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Lydia. So we're a little bit past the top of the hour. So I'm going to have one more question for you both before we wrap up here. Um, we talked a lot about the issue, understanding the issue, the impacts to water resources in various ways, and there are more, obviously, to explore and more that we'll learn about. Um, Lydia, you talked about some of the most recent policy developments that we're all very excited about in terms of increasing transparency around existing water use by the industry. And I think what will necessarily still be more work to understand that with new reporting data or strengthening those same requirements in the coming years as well through further policy reforms. To say nothing about, again, Lydia, as you pointed to, what's still unknown, right, about impacts that hasn't been quantified yet or really characterized through research to water impacts. Um, so with an eye towards policy, to close us out, and recognizing that with anything, especially something this complicated, there's no silver bullet, right? Um, if you had a magic wand to wave and you could have a state lawmaker, a local lawmaker, maybe lawmakers at the basin level, regionally, adopt one policy, um, what would that policy be do? What would that policy be, right? What would it do? And can you suggest something that directly focuses on securing our water use into the future or addressing water pollution from this sector?
Ooh, David, I am terrible with only choosing one of
Yeah.
anything in life. Uh, but let's say one thing for this upcoming General Assembly.
Great.
Okay, that's what I will say. in Maryland this last year, we had Delegate Sheila Ruth, who introduced a bill for transparency that would have required data centers, both incoming data centers and existing data centers, to report to the state, to local jurisdictions, and for that information to be public, to report on estimated water consumption, the type of cooling system that they're using, the frequency with which they're filling it, if it's like a closed loop cooling system, the type of energy, if it's diesel generators, like what kind. I don't want any diesel generators, but actually how much energy they're using, the impacts to the land, why this data center is needed, how it is operating, and it also required every county over, I believe, 1,000 people, but don't quote me on it, with a minimum population, every county with a certain minimum population, to create a plan for how if data centers come, how they would be regulated, where they would have to go, with limitations with where they could go, and in order to protect people and to protect the environment. It was such a beautiful bill that I think was probably one of the, because we cannot, it's hard to regulate what you don't know about. And there is so much unknown with data centers because of the non-disclosure agreements and because of the lack of reporting requirements. It would have been a monumental first step to really providing the needed transparency for data center development. So that would be my choice for a bill, even though it doesn't put limits on water or renewable energy, which I want all of those things, but I also want to know exactly what we're dealing with.
And I totally agree. From a Virginia perspective, there's a lot of emphasis on getting the data centers now to talk about where their energy is going to come from. But I think water impacts, both from a quantity and quality standpoint, really need to be emphasized. The other thing I would add is, again, if I could wave a magic wand, I'd like to see a 1-year study of water and the water impacts of data centers on the Potomac specifically, because I feel like there are so many of these things that are being concentrated in the Potomac Basin, whether it's in the outlying areas of West Virginia or whether it's right sitting on the banks of the Occoquan River, that there's really needs to be a grown-up in the room that says, what's this really mean for the drinking supplies of this region? What does this mean for the groundwater? What does this mean for the fishery? All of that. And I'm actually going to be pushing the Virginia legislature to do something on that, because I feel that Lydia's pointing out very well that there's a lot of impacts we're not really very sure of, and there's a lot of dangerous stuff that these data centers have either within them or on their grounds that can get into the water. And so if I had a third thing, because you've asked for one and I'm cheating, I would set up really sophisticated, smart monitoring systems at the mouths of some of these creeks that are where the data centers are concentrated, because I feel like there's no early warning system if there's a spill. There's no subtle system that picks up that PFAS are beginning to leak into the river at a higher rate, or that somehow some of these cooling chemicals or whatever are leaking in. And I feel like disclosure, openness, daylighting, all of those things are really what's needed, because there's a flaw in the if you think about it, there's a flaw in the whole data center structure, and that is that local officials are treating these as though they're typical planning and zoning discussions. So they talk about how tall the building is, what color the sides are. They talk about how far it's set back from a property line. It's been a big discussion in Prince William about whether they should be 100 feet or 150 feet, as though that's a big concession. And nobody's talking, there's no grown up in the room who's saying, wait a minute, these things are industrial. They're having all kinds of impacts. They're, making people sick. There's a public health risk here. That all needs to be looked at. And we had hoped that the study that was done a couple of years ago by the state legislature would have addressed that, but it wasn't the right circumstance. And I think we're in a better circumstance now to get some decent study done of this issue, both in Maryland and in Virginia.
Great. Thank you both. Much wiser policy analysts than I am. I wanted you to go straight to the perfect solution, and you were smart. We need more studies and more plans, right, to craft those perfect solutions. Thank you both for your time. Thanks, everyone in attendance here, for joining. Really great questions, really propelled what I thought was really thoughtful and informative discussion through our almost 90 minutes here. Lydia mentioned looking ahead to General Assembly work next year. We're doing that as well, of course, in partnership with our friends at Nature Forward, other groups in coalitions in our region here. So I'd appeal to everyone in attendance to stay connected, not just to Potomac Riverkeeper Network and to Nature Forward, but to other groups like Piedmont Environmental Council and others leading on this very issue, to learn more about those legislative opportunities that we'll hear more about later in the year. We'll have to do a legislative preview of some kind, focused just on data centers as well, because that will be another actionable opportunity for folks to engage and with their lawmakers and promote some of these policy solutions. So with that, I'm going to conclude our webinar. Thanks again, everyone. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day and week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.